and welcome to the next episode of War Tech Talk, Eastern Circle's podcast on defense and geopolitics. I'm Anastasia Shapachkina, president of Eastern Circle's think tank in Paris and host of this podcast. Just before Turkey made the news following the arrest on March 19th of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, triggering mass protests, Eastern Circles recorded two interviews on Turkey's balancing diplomacy as a supporter of Ukraine, a strategic partner of Russia, and a member of NATO, and on Turkey's role in global geopolitics with a leading expert on the country, Eugenia Garber. We'd like to share the first interview with you in this episode of War Tech Talk. Enjoy! In our podcast on how the war in Ukraine has transformed modern warfare through drones, we mentioned the role of Turkey in the war with Russia as an ally of Ukraine and of NATO, but also a strategic partner of Moscow. True to our promise during that podcast, today we'll explore the role of Turkey both in the war in Ukraine, in regional wars in the Middle East and North Africa, and in regional and global governance organizations. Turkey is a key partner for NATO, Ukraine, and Russia due to Ankara's unique foreign policy and defense position. We'll be discussing today with a leading expert on Turkey, Eugenia Garber, the Atlantic Council's senior fellow, and also a professor of national security studies at George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, a foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine in 2021. Before that, she was deputy director of the Diplomatic Academy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine between 2018 to 2020, and served as a diplomat in the Ukrainian embassy in Ankara between 2014 and 2018. Eugenia Garber is a German Marshall Fund, Marshall Memorial Fellow, as well as non-resident senior fellow at the Center in Modern Turkish Studies, Carleton University. She is widely published and is frequent speaker at the diplomatic and defense academies across Europe. She specializes in European and Black Sea security with a particular focus on Ukraine, Turkey, and Russia. Eugenia, welcome to War Tech Talk.
Hi, Anastasia, and thank you for having me.
Let's begin with Turkey-Russia relations. This relationship is characterized by a complex interplay of strategic competition, pragmatic cooperation, and Ankara views Moscow both as a rival, particularly in the Black Sea region, and as a necessary partner in energy, trade, and geopolitical stability. And to start with energy, that's something that's really attracted a lot of media attention, has a lot been under the microscope. There are three aspects, right? Natural gas and oil have gotten most of the media attention, but there is also nuclear energy cooperation, which is essential, strategic for Turkey, and this evolves around the Akuyu nuclear power plant project. What is the meaning of nuclear energy for Erdogan, and what is his vision for the future use of it? How do you assess the level of dependence of Turkey on Russia for this critical technology, and inversely of Russia on Turkey as a client, as a first-time nuclear country, which Turkey is?
Thank you for this question. I think it's a really important one. But to start with, I'm sure it's important to look at Turkey's long journey towards nuclear power, nuclear energy ambitions, which starts well before 2010, when there was the first agreement between Russia and Turkey on nuclear cooperation. Ankara's quest for nuclear energy dates to the late 1950s, and for the variety of reasons, this had never become possible before early 2000s. For a variety of reasons, starting from military coups in 1970s to financial reasons to economic reasons, etc., etc. But at the core of this nuclear ambition, there is at least, I would say, there are at least three main goals. One is economic factor, second is energy diversification, and third is modernization of Turkey and turning Turkey into a global power in a way, because you mentioned that is Turkey a regional power, is Turkey a global power. So this energy factor, I think that's one of the ways to prove that Turkey is a modern developed country which has space technologies, which has new technologies in defense sector and also energy technology. So this is really crucial. This is part of the current government's plans for 2030, for 2050. When you look at the future of Turkey's development, the nuclear energy is always there. Now, when we come to what it means in terms of Russian-Turkish relation, this is a really important aspect, because when the decision was made that Akkuyu nuclear power plant in Mersin will be built by Rosatom, the format of this cooperation is a build, own, operate model, meaning that at least for 60, but probably for 80 years, Russia will completely control everything which happens in Akkuyu nuclear power plant. Rosatom is a state-controlled nuclear energy company, which I think is important to understand. So this dependence of Turkey on Russia in terms of nuclear energy, it starts with Russia providing fuel for this power plant to completely controlling, operating everything which is happening in the Akkuyu nuclear power plant for 60 years during the service life of the NPP, including also training of the personnel in Turkey who will be operating this nuclear power plant, and goes until its decommissioning, which Rosatom will also be responsible for. That's why I say that it's at least 60 years when Russia will operate the Akkuyu nuclear power plant, but it can be extended for 20 years more. And then you can also add to this managing the waste generated during the operation of the power plant, to providing regulatory framework of the operation of the nuclear power plant. And also, of course, this is a physical control of the strategic facility in the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. So it's quite close to Syria, where Russia still has two bases, and we have to see what happens to them. It's close to Incirlik military base in the south of Turkey. So it's quite important, because we know how Russia normally uses its power plants in different parts of the world. On the Russian side, of course, this is also a project quite important because of the strategic reasons that I've mentioned so far, but also because this will be the first Russian nuclear power plant on the territory of the foreign state, so outside of Russia. And this is exactly how Russia addresses and refers to this nuclear power plant, saying this is a Russian NPP in Turkey rather than Turkish NPP. This can be a part of a Russian information campaign and propaganda, but this also shows that Russia sees it as a strategic asset. And with Rosatom, again, being a state-owned company, just as Gazprom is, obviously Russia sees it as a part of its foreign policy, as a possible leverage over other countries. And this is the first NPP in a row of other NPPs to be built by Russia in a variety of countries, from Egypt to possibly Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, all other countries with which Russia is in the state of negotiations to build its power plants in the years to come.
Erdogan's ambitions were to turn Turkey into a gas hub for Europe. How far has Turkey's original vision of itself as a key player of Europe's energy security, thanks to Russia and Azerbaijan, has materialized? And how dependent on Russia is Turkey for its own energy security?
Well, Turkey becoming an energy hub in Europe is a good thing. And if it's implemented in a proper way, this is something that can contribute to Turkey's own security, not only energy security, but also national security, meaning being less dependent on Russia. And also to the European energy security. That's important because Turkey can bring to Europe a mix of gas from Azerbaijan, first of all, TANAP pipeline. It can also be Turkmenistan gas from the Caspian region. There are discussions about Iraqi gas, also potentially, though it's very complicated now, but we can talk about the Mediterranean resources and Turkish own gas, which is Sakarya gas field in the Black Sea, which is one of the biggest, and I think the biggest one actually in the Black Sea, at least which is now in the active process of operation and drilling works, etc., etc. So if Turkey manages to do that, also given the Russian aggression in Ukraine and how Russia weaponizes gas and oil and nuclear power against many countries, not only Turkey, but European countries and Black Sea countries in the past. Look at what happens in Moldova, in Transnistria, etc., etc. So that can be a great leverage against Russian political and strategic influence in the Black Sea region. With this being said, it's also important to mention that Russia is doing everything possible to increase Turkey's strategic dependence on its energy resources. When we were talking about the nuclear power plant in Mersin Akkuyu, we forgot to mention plans to build 2 more nuclear power plants, one in Sinop in the Black Sea region of Turkey and another one in the European part in the west of Turkey in Thracia, which potentially can be built with different partners, and Russia is in negotiations at least over the Sinop NPP. And of course, Turkey imports a lot of gas from Russia. In previous times, it used to be almost a half of Turkish imports. Now it's less than that. It's 40-something%, but still it's quite a big portion of what Turkey imports. So when Russia talks about the gas hub in Turkey, and when Turkey talks about becoming a gas hub or energy hub for Europe, these are 2 different concepts. And one of the reasons why this idea has not materialized so far is because of this difference in visions. Because what Russia wants to see is, again, controlling this gas hub in Turkey and just providing energy resources, and then dictating the price policy, choosing partners, physically locating this gas hub in Turkey, but to be frank, using Turkey to bypass European sanctions, to call it a Turkish gas, a mixture of different gas molecules, like 5% of Azerbaijani gas or Turkish gas, and then 95% of the Russian gas, and selling it to Europe. This is the vision of Russia. The vision of Turkey is still diversification of resources, becoming energy hub for Europe, and positioning itself on the world energy markets as a gas hub in a strategically important location.
About oil, you mentioned sanctions, so those would more apply to oil. Let's say gas is more about the strategy of Europe to diminish the Russian imports, but oil is really the sanctioned area, and there Turkish straits are a key route for rerouting Russian sanctioned oil from China and India back to the EU. How does Turkey help Russia to avoid sanctions in energy and critical components? Because it's not just about oil, but also about all of those components we then find, the Western components we find in Russian weapons, for example. And what is Ankara's interest in doing so, since it also is a NATO member and an ally of Ukraine? How much of this behavior actually being definitely a sanctions rerouting hub, so to say, can be explained by the dependence on Russia on energy, for example, and how much by Turkey's own economic or strategic interest?
Well, when it comes to the straits, it's important to understand that the first thing that everyone will tell you in Turkey is the Montreux Convention, which regulates the passage of the warships, but also of all other ships through the straits during the time of war and during the time of peace. When it comes to the warships, that's something that Turkey has been praised for 3 years of the full-scale invasion, fair enough, for closing the straits for the Russian warships and any other warships. So basically, there is no way how those warships can now get into the Black Sea. And with doing so, Turkey helped Ukraine because Russia is not able to bring in any more warships to the Black Sea. And Turkey also helped itself by cutting the so-called Syria Express, the route of logistic supplies for Russia in between the temporarily occupied Crimea and its bases in Syria. And that, in a way, contributed to the current success of Turkey and in the fall of the Assad regime and in the weakening of Russia in Syria. And of course, Turkey didn't directly damage the Russian fleet, but it benefited a lot from Ukraine diminishing Russian naval capabilities in the Black Sea, from destroying 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet, I'm talking about Ukraine, and destroying Russian air defense systems, naval assets in the occupied territories in Crimea, but also in the Black Sea. For Turkey, this is a huge benefit because now it's a dominant naval power in the Black Sea. So this is one thing. And here, Turkey obviously helps Ukraine. It's a responsible NATO member, and that's something to be to praise Turkey for. On the other hand, when we talk about the oil trade, when we talk about the looted grain from Ukraine, this is a huge topic in itself, how Russia exports the grain stolen from the occupied territories of Ukraine. And also these vessels go through these straits and all the other things that you mentioned, export controls, dual-use goods, sensitive elements and technologies. Here, directly, Turkey can do nothing in, at least this is the official position of Turkey, that Ankara can do nothing in terms of stopping these vessels in the straits because there is no provision to do that in the Montreux Convention. So legally, and of course, this is a question of a political will, but also legally, technically, literally, if you look at the Montreux Convention, it's very difficult to find a clause that would legitimize blocking the passage of these Russian ships or any other ships through the straits. Now, with this being said, it's obvious that Russia is very often using auxiliary ships, the so-called commercial or civilian ships, to bring in and out weapons, arms, equipment, reportedly even some personnel through the straits.
And there are strong suspicions that it's impossible, that Turkey doesn't know anything about it. That,
of course, Turkey knows that, also because Ukraine informs Turkey about this, also because there are all satellite images, also because there is all this footage, video, photo evidence that this happens. But because of some precedent that happened in the past when Turkey stopped one of the vessels, not Russian one, I mean, that's something in 1970s or even earlier, and then there was a whole legal collision of whether Turkey could do that, had the right to do that or not. So you would hear a lot of reference to that accident, but also now because Turkey is dependent on the Russian gas markets, geopolitical interests, economic interests, because Turkey doesn't want escalation in the Black Sea, because there is a fear that if Turkey is pushing hard in Russia, it may not get enough support of other NATO allies who would not like to be dragged into the Third World War. You know, the whole argument about the de-escalation, escalation management, not go into the nuclear war, not go into the Third World War with Russia.
it works on Erdogan as much as it does on the European leaders, this Russian rhetoric.
Yes, this Russian rhetoric works, and it works even more because Turkey is way closer to Russia than some of the countries in Europe, and also because there is a belief in Turkey historically that whatever happens in the Black Sea has to be managed by Turkey. So Turkey doesn't want to see more presence of the United States, for example, in the Black Sea, of other external actors. This means that if Turkey doesn't get more support nationally in terms of boosting Turkey's own defense and deterrence posture in the Black Sea because of all the problem that Turkey has in its relations with its Western partners. And it doesn't want to turn the Black Sea into the area of great power competition between NATO and Russia. Turkey will do everything possible to kind of close its eyes on what's happening and not to escalate with Russia. Also because of all other regional conflicts where Turkey has its interests and it has to manage this escalation with Russia. And one point which is really important is what Russia is doing to kind of use all hybrid ways of doing this in a shadow way. It's not like Russia is crystal clear about what it's doing. The whole thing about the operation of the shadow fleet, how Russia is using electronic warfare to show that these vessels are just not vessels coming from the occupied ports of Crimea, but rather from Novorossiysk or the port of Kafkas or something like that. All the fake documents that Russia is using, just putting bluntly all the false information on the documents, etc., etc. But when it comes to Turkey, with all the e-warfare, with all the spoofing and jamming and false documents and fake documents, for Turkey, this is kind of an ambiguous situation when it cannot directly say that there is a violation of the international law. So there is a lot of this mix of political...
Or it can be used as a leeway to hide behind by saying, well, it is ambiguous, so we don't really know. Well, in fact, they do know, and they have a leverage, and it allows them to maybe then not to use it, basically.
And that's a good bargaining chip in negotiations, both with the Western partners, with Russia. So it's a lot about pragmatic economic interest, strategic interest, legal issues, and the current situation with the Russia's manipulating and weaponizing these fears of nuclear escalation.
But it's true that I would rather bet on that, they kind of hiding behind these excuses and kind of exploiting the ambiguity, than on the argument that Erdogan is maybe afraid of escalation. Although I hear you absolutely with the NATO fleet, he wants to become to remain the only NATO power in the Black Sea. But Turkey's relationship with Russia in the military sphere, right, in defense, has shown that Erdogan is one of the few leaders in the world who is not afraid of escalation. For example, we all remember October 2015, shooting down of the Russian jet airplane off the border with Syria as soon as it entered the Turkish territory. And that brings me to this, maybe the next step of our discussion on defense cooperation with Russia, which is really so puzzling. And so the least, I think, for me, the least understandable aspect of the Turkish strategy. And of course, I'm thinking about this S-400 purchases, despite Russian approval, which on the one hand cost Turkey a US denial to sell F-16 fighter jets, which now they're coming back to around F-35 fighter jets discussion, still a very thorny issue. And also the helicopters, but also on the other hand, probably facilitated Turkish defense autonomy and the development of the Turkish military industry. So in the end of the day, it was kind of a blessing in disguise. Since the famous S-400 purchase, Russia invaded Ukraine. Turkey has continued defense cooperation with Ukraine and was the first country to give air support through Bayraktar drones, if we can call that air support, and then saw the US export restrictions lifted in response to Turkey's decisions to lift the veto on Sweden joining NATO. However, the US is still refusing to export now F-35 planes to Turkey over the fears that if both S-400 system and F-35 are connected to the Turkish Air Force Information Network, HVBS, Russians may obtain through S-400 systems radars the data about US fighter jets, which would allow Russians to track and target them more effectively, including in Ukraine. The question for me is, why did Turkey decide to purchase S-400 in the first place when it could have bought US Patriot systems, for example, or maybe some alternative systems, maybe from India or something?
S-400 is not about Turkey's cooperation, defense cooperation with Russia in the long term, because I don't believe that Turkey sees Russia as a credible defense partner, let alone as a strategic partner, like 100% strategic partner when we're talking about really strategic relationships. And I was going to give some of the examples of the United States, but now with the new administration in the White House, it's really difficult to say which strategic partnership with Canada, for example, of the United States you can mention here, but that's a different topic. So anyway, I don't believe that Turkey sees Russia as a strategic partner that can be trusted in terms of the defense, technology, etc., etc. Turkey has all this experience that you mentioned with open conflicts with Russia, with many proxy wars, where Turkey is supporting different political forces on the ground than Russia is, and also many cases like Georgia, Ukraine, etc., when Turkey supports the territorial integrity of these countries and Russia invades these countries. Hence, any deep cooperation with Russia on defense technologies is obviously a threat to Turkey, and I think there is this understanding in Turkey. If you don't speak about some kind of really marginal Eurasianist forces who want to kind of sell Turkey to Russia just for the idea of this Eurasia or money, I don't know for what, but this is a really, really small marginal group. There is understanding of all the threat of cooperation in maritime and defense sphere with Russia inside Turkey. The context is important. When S-400 was bought, that was just after the coup attempt in Turkey, after the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey. And of course, Russia did everything possible and impossible to show that the United States is an enemy to Turkey. Russia is a big friend because reportedly, Putin helped Erdogan to win this case and kind of saved his life. This is the Russian argument, of course, whereas Fethullah Gulen and all the conspiracy theories there about the potential US contributions to this coup attempt, as portrayed by Russia, were used, and they were everywhere in the Turkish media, etc., etc. So back then, the S-400 was not about long-term cooperation in defense with Russia. It was about a domestic political situation inside Turkey. It was about all the fueled concerns about the cooperation with the United States. It was about the anti-American sentiment in Turkey. It was a geopolitical choice back then, or a political choice back then, to do this one short-term deal with Russia, particularly on S-400 versus F-16, F-35, which are NATO American aircraft. And back then, after the 2016, they were seen very differently. The second reason is about patriots and alternatives to that, because when you talk to someone in Turkey, everyone would tell you that could Turkey get F-35, Patriot systems back then, there would have never been this deal with S-400 with Russia, but because Turkey could not get Patriot systems from Western partners for a variety of reasons, pricing policy, political considerations, negotiations, etc., Turkey had to look for alternatives. So for me, this S-400 deal was about political messaging to the West from Turkey, saying, hey, you're not the only option we have. So if we don't get Patriots from the West, then we can get S-400 from Russia, for example. Now, I would say 99% of Turkish experts and analysts say that was a huge mistake, with all the repercussions, with all the implications following, including the F-35 program, sanctions, cuts of sanctions, or other sanctions on Turkey. Now, luckily, we see the reverse process when Turkey is getting back on track in its cooperation with the Western partners. But that was a huge low point in Turkey's relations with the West during the period following the 2016 coup attempt. The main result of all these developments is how Turkey became more self-sufficient, relying on its own components, developing its own autonomous defense industry, which is still dependent on the Western components, on the Western technology, but still it's way more autonomous. How Turkey contributed to the development of indigenous technologies, homegrown technologies, you name it, from from the drones and from the aircraft like Khan jet, for example, to all the corvettes and all the naval project that Turkey now has. So for me, the main results of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and in the Black Sea region, Turkey's problems in relations with both the West and Russia, was this attempt to make Turkey an independent player in terms of defense industry, defense technologies, and developing its own complex would provide the if not 100%, then the majority of what Turkey needs to defend itself and to boost its defense and deterrence posture in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and generally in the region, which is quite a tough region for Turkey to be in.
Very interesting. I'm just going to then a bit fast forward to the question about the Turkey-UK relations. Actually, that brings me to that thought, because this model of strategic autonomy in defense production, to which essentially this embargo on F-16s, so to say, led, right, which you could say triggered and facilitated its development. To me, it looks today that Ukraine is very inspired by the Turkish model, that Ukraine is striving, obviously with different resources, different time, and much harder circumstances. It would love to be there where Turkey is, and is striving to emulate it. Turkey has started building the relationship defense cooperation with Ukraine just right after this, or right around these negotiations about S-400 purchase after a downed Russian military jet in 2016. And at the break of the war, this military cooperation grew into a commitment of joint production of drones in Ukraine. And today we hear of possibilities of joint production of military planes even. What is the reach of defense industry partnership today between Turkey and Ukraine? And how do you assess future prospects of it?
To answer shortly, I think that the Ukrainian-Turkish military defense and naval cooperation in the Black Sea is a potential backbone and axis of the new security structure in the Black Sea region after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and Russian aggression in the region, not only Ukraine, but also Georgia, military presence in Moldova, etc., etc. And I will unpack this. If you look from Ukraine's perspective, Russia is a threat independently on what happens in Ukraine right now, even if there is a ceasefire or a peace in the future, which I really doubt is something to happen in the near future, but still, Russia is a threat even without hot conflict in Ukraine. It's there to stay independently of the regime. Is it a Putin regime? Is it post-Putin regime? It's there to stay, and it's there to stay as a threat for Ukraine and for the region. So for Ukraine, it's important to develop relations in defense and in all spheres with the Western partners, obviously, NATO membership, EU membership, all that, and also with the regional countries. And in this regard, Turkey is a key partner for Ukraine in each and every aspect, from joint defense industry projects to naval cooperation, to safeguarding the maritime security, freedom of navigation, commercial freedoms. Every single aspect is related to Turkey's position. So Turkey is a key partner, of course, together with Bulgaria, Romania, which are NATO members. But when you compare the naval capabilities, the air defense capabilities of these three NATO allies in the Black Sea region, Turkey is number one. Ukraine's and Turkey's systems are complementary to each other because Ukraine has knowledge, Ukraine has technologies, Ukraine has a way to do things, very creative, as we now see, very innovative. Turkey has financial resources. Turkey has a well-developed defense industry complex. So this cooperation is really beneficial for both of these countries. When you look at the situation from the Turkish perspective, Ukraine is a key partner because it's not a NATO, external NATO member. It's not non-literal NATO member like, let's say, the United States or France or Germany. So Turkey's concept of the regional ownership, when the Black Sea region has to be something for the regional countries, first of all. So the regional countries have to deal with all the problems which happen in the Black Sea and have to come up with regional solutions. Ukraine fits perfectly well into this concept because Ukraine is a Black Sea country. On the other hand, Ukraine is important to counterbalance Russian presence in the region. And as I mentioned before, Russia is seen as a rival in Turkey. For centuries and centuries, starting from the Russian-Ottoman wars, Russia has been a strategic rival for Turkey. So there is no friendship or trust to Russia in Turkey. But there is a desire to counterbalance NATO, and Turkey itself is a NATO member, but still there is this concept of counterbalancing NATO, meaning US presence in the region, and also counterbalancing Russian military presence in the region. And for that purpose, Ukraine is a perfect natural ally for Turkey because it can help destroy Russian naval dominance in the region. I mentioned before, Ukraine has been very successful in its war against Russia in the Black Sea itself. It has effectively destroyed Russian fleet, Russian bases, weakened Russia. It all benefits Turkey a lot. But on the other hand, Ukraine is a Black Sea state which very often has the same interests as Turkey has. So this cooperation is now a vibrant cooperation despite all the differences in, approaches to Russia when it comes to energy, sanctions, economy, everything we discussed so far. So there is something when Ukraine negotiates with Turkey, how Turkey can do better in deterring Russia and not filling Russian budget with new money and new sources for fueling its war machine and killing the Ukrainians. But at the same time, there is a huge area where Turkey and Ukraine cooperate. This is beneficial for Turkey, for Ukraine, for Europe, for European security, and also for the generally transatlantic security, because Ukraine, as an aspirant member to NATO, to the European Union, is also very important as a, I don't want to say bridge, but in anchoring Turkey in this transatlantic area, because all these countries share the same interest. And this interest is deterring Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, all these axes of authoritarian aggressive countries which challenge the European security and rules-based international order.
Questions for this episode were prepared by Anastasia Shabachkina and Bahram Kostuk. Production by Elisa Galeva.